Mama, Daddy, what we gonna eat? This just the day after Thanksgiving now. We ain't got nothing to eat. They don't want Thanksgiving anymore. But if you know, like I know, when you grow up in a house with a whole lot of siblings, you're going to eat whatever's in the refrigerator. Or you're not going to eat at all. And so this is what they did time and time and time again. They complained, and they murmured. And then it makes you wonder now, when they came out of Egypt, how did they come out of Egypt? What did God do? He divided the Red Sea, right? So God parted the Red Sea, right? And you notice in every complaint, what do they want to go back to? They want to go back to Egypt, right? The question then becomes, how are they going to get back? If God had to part the Red Sea, perform a miracle to get them out, how are they going to go back? But they just go to show you the delusion of many people sometimes when they don't live and move and walk by faith. So now you have all of these examples, and there are many more. It's about, I think it was about a total of 10. Because God would say in Numbers chapter 13 that they have tempted me these 10 times. But then I go to the New Testament.
You know, they didn't realize that even though they said, well, we was in Egypt, we ate those and a few corns and garlic and all this leftovers in Egypt. But really, God was giving that to them.
In a sense, yeah. Because, I mean, Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. So even though they were enjoying it under the hand of Pharaoh, it was still God's provisions. And so, but they couldn't see that because they weren't living by faith. Now when you get to the New Testament, this is the application of the lessons in the Old Testament about murmuring and complaining. Look at Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. Notice what Paul does. And Paul is drawing this from Old Testament Israel. Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15.
Do all things without murmuring and disputing.
I wonder where he got that from. He said, do all things without murmurings and disputings. And then notice the next verse.
That you may be blameless and harmless, the Son of God
Without rebuke. Because Israel in the Old Testament, when they complained and they murmured and they chided with Moses and Aaron, God rebuked them every single time. Then notice what else it says.
In the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as a light in this world.
So Paul is telling Christians to learn the lesson from Old Testament Israel, not to murmur, not to dispute, not to complain about every single thing. So he says, do all things without murmurings and disputings. And so murmuring and complaining and chiding, all those things sometimes need to be rebuked and they need to be handled swiftly because sometimes it can get out of hand like it did in the Old Testament Israel. Anyone else?
Brother Teacher, do you think that it seemed like even from the times of the early Israelites, even up to today, it appears that that is a seed that's in our nature.
What, to complain?
Control, yeah.
To complain, yeah.
I think we all not only complain, but we have what we need to have to survive.
Yeah.
Everybody here got what they need to live, but we always desire more.
Yeah.
Lord, can I do this? We got a house, or maybe we want a bigger house, or we want more land, or we want a better car, bigger car, whatever it may be in each individual case.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like we Israelites, we do the Red Sea, but we still want more.
Yeah, I think.
That, wish I had that, you know. I just wonder, that's our nature that we have to keep in check.
I think earlier generation called it being a loan guy. just always wanting something that you see. You don't necessarily need it. You don't necessarily need, you're not necessarily going to benefit from it. You just want to have access to it or you want it because you see it. Interestingly enough, if we're still in the book of Philippians, in the same book, he mentions doing all things without murmurings and disputings. But in the same book, we go to chapter 4, Philippians chapter 4. Notice what he says. The antithesis to complaining and murmuring and chiding, the solution to that is Philippians 4:11 through 13. Paul says what?
Not that I speak in respect of one, for I've learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content.
See, that's what we have to learn how to do. We got to learn how to be content. We have to learn how to, you know what, the word content means to be satisfied. We sing that song, I'm satisfied with just a cottage below. We have to learn how to be satisfied. We have to learn how to be content. And the thing about that is, the thing about contentment is everybody has to learn their own level of contentment. It's not the same for everybody. And so everybody needs to learn what makes them content, what makes them happy. And then notice what else he says.
I know both how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me.
So Paul is saying that we need to learn how to be content because contentment is a learned behavior, and also not only is it a learned behavior, but it should be a practiced and disciplined behavior. So whenever I talk about contentment, things that we all think about, most of us, we got more than enough, right? If you go to your house right now, you got enough shoes? Enough clothes? I was talking to Greg a couple weeks ago. I said, man, we know it. And truthfully, in all honesty, because when we use the word rich is a comparative term. Most of us got enough clothes, we can go shopping in our own closet. That's how good we doing. What about men's shirts and ties? You got enough? You probably gonna get some more for Father's Day too, What, cologne? Perfume? Jewelry? Food? Huh? It's amazing how you think about it. Man, sometimes you have to throw away more food than you keep. And so God has blessed us, and so we just have to learn how to be content. And then you start looking, and like you said, we sometimes do like Old Testament Israel. We look around and we see the celebrities and see what they got, and you know what? Like, man, you know what? It would be nice. I know last week Rick Ross had his car show. Rick Ross got about 300 vehicles. You can't drive with one at one time. Nice to have, nice collection. And so, we'll look at something like that, say, man, I wouldn't mind having about 10 or 15 cars, You still can't drive with one at one time. And so we start looking. Y'all remember years and years ago, y'all remember Robin Leach? Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And they would show the lifestyles of the rich and famous, the glamorous houses, the main house, the vacation home, the house for the child. And then Cribs came along, kind of did the same thing. And so what society does, society always going to show us what everybody else has, what we think we want and what we think we need. And so guess what we end up doing? We end up trying to kill ourselves, working, trying to be like what we see on television. And we just need to learn how to be content. We're Brown.
It's funny, Trina and I were just talking about that on the way in. It's like, it's almost by design. And
Yeah.
Perpetuate a discomfort in self in which you're always striving to achieve more things that you don't necessarily need.
Absolutely. Solomon said is vexation and vanity of spirit. Solomon said it's just empty to keep longing for things one thing Solomon said the eye is never full. He's never satisfied. And so we just have to learn how to be content and learn from Old Testament Israel that we need not complain and murmur so much. Anyone else?
Sometimes I know for like Rodney and I are totally different in that aspect.
Okay.
He's like, you don't need that. No.
Mm-hmm.
And even with Mom, she'd be like, I just don't understand. My contentment is, we had a little bitty house in Snellville. That was my favorite house. When we got the big house, that's when I lost all my kids.
More to clean up too.
Everybody had their own room, had their own TV. We wasn't eating together. We wasn't doing it. And so mine is low. And sometimes we want stuff for people that they don't necessarily
Absolutely.
want.
And they don't put the same value on it that we put on it.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yep. That's a very good point. Another thing you end up realizing too is you sometimes substitute quality for quantity. Like you end up, like you said, get a bigger house, get another vehicle, stuff like that. And then now, like you think, for example, it used to be a time, with one family vehicle. Everybody got to squeeze in that one car. We had my dad had a 40 Econoline van. All 8 of us was in that van. Now, everybody, husband got a car, wife got a car, all the kids got a car, and you'll never see each other together anymore because everybody going in a different direction. So sometimes we end up doing that. Not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it just ended up replacing the quality that we had when we was all together. So we have to be mindful of those things like that. And so we need to learn how to be content. Anyone else?
I think they need to do a series on after the rich and famous, then show them dead in that little graveyard only so many feet wide and long. He had 1,000 acres when that he in a little spot.
Just like
That's where it's gonna be.
just like we talked about the rich man in Luke 16. When it was all said and done, the beggar died, and the rich man died too. So death does not discriminate.
Equalize.
Absolutely. And so we need to understand that. All right, let's go back to Matthew 18. We were talking about offenses. Thus the question, Brother Dowdy mentioned that sometimes in the church we can have people who just complain about everything, and that can be a stumbling block for other people who don't complain about everything. But we always need to be optimistic when it comes down to the local congregation. We need to be optimistic. We need to be encouraging. We need to always think the best of each other and what the church can do. All right, Matthew 18, verses 10 through 14.
Before you leave that word offend, I think some of us misuse and abuse that word. We may tell somebody the truth, and they say, "Well, you offended me." Well, just like Jesus in Matthew 15.
Right.
When he told those Pharisees who Sadducees the truth, his disciples came and said, "Hey, you offended us. You
Right.
offended." Jesus said, "Oh, I'm so sorry."
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, let's go back and read it. Look at Matthew 15. That's a very good point. And it's not always the case that it's intentional. Matthew 15. Let's read the first 3 verses, and then we'll go to the verse where Jesus, when they came at Jesus, said, did you defended them? Matthew 15.
Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees who were of Jerusalem, saying, Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. But he answered and said unto them, Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition?
Now, which one is more important? The tradition of the elders or the commandments of God? So what happened, and we talked about this when we were in Matthew 15, the elders had esteemed their oral tradition and their oral commandments higher than the commandments of God. Read on.
For God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, Whoever shall say to his father or his mother, It is a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free.
You got to take care of mother and father. That's the whole point Jesus was trying to teach. But what they were trying to do, the scribes and the Pharisees, they had figured out a way to get around taking care of mother and father. So in verse number 7, what did Jesus call them? He called them hypocrites because y'all trying to point the finger at me and my disciples for not washing our hands because we violating you all's tradition, but y'all are actually violating something much greater and much higher, that is the commandments of God, and Jesus called them hypocrites. Now when you drop down and you look at verse number 12, notice what happens.
Then came his disciples and said unto him, Knowest thou that the Pharisees were offended after they heard this saying?
Now the disciples, I believe the disciples here were trying to soften the blow. Because the disciples came to Jesus and said, Jesus, don't you realize that, what you said kind of offended the scribes and the Pharisees? Mind you, the disciples coming and telling Jesus this, when the very people they try to take up for are saying, y'all violating our traditions. And so notice what Jesus says.
But he answered and said, Every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up.
Every plant that represented these teachings that they had that were trying to substitute for the word of God. Jesus says every plant, every teaching, every doctrine that does not come from God, it will be rooted up. Jesus did not apologize. He didn't say, well, you know what, let me go back and and clean it up. Let me go back and you know what? Let me reword what I said, Brother Mitchell.
What happened is, was actually a lot of times Christians get the term peacemaker in modern times rather than in Greek language. Jesus was a peacemaker.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to jump into conflict and cut you up. That's the peacemaker in Greek time. People get it mixed up like you go peacemaker in the modern time. Hey man, hold. We don't want nobody to get upset. That ain't what Greek. That's not biblical.
Right.
Biblical peacemaker. I'm coming here. I'm gonna stir some stuff. I'm gonna put some hot spice in that soup, and there's gonna be some flame when I explain to you the correct truth. And that's what peacemaking in Greek time. You are jumping into conflict to bring in truth.
Yeah, in modern times, when people think about being peacemaker, they think you're a pushover. You know, you supposed to be a Christian. When people say that, what they're really saying is, you supposed to let me walk over you, and do whatever I want, and you supposed to accept it because you supposed to be the bigger person, and you supposed to be the Christian. And so that's what they're actually saying, but fail to realize, you know what, we're supposed to be wise as serpents and harmless as a dove. And so we're not going to let people, you're not going to use me just because I'm a Christian. You're not going to talk to me in any kind of way. You're not going to treat me in any kind of way just because I'm a Christian. And so sometimes with peace, sometimes things have to be said, things have to be done that may not feel good. But in order for to get reconciliation many times, those conversations have to be had and those actions have to be taken. So absolutely, people have the word peace misconstrued. All right, going back to Matthew 18. Matthew 18, even Jesus said, you know, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. When he talked about bringing peace. All right, Matthew chapter 18, verses 10 through 14.
Take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones. For I say unto you, that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost. How think ye, if a man have 100 sheep, and one of them gone astray, doth he not leave the 99 and go into the mountains and seek that which is gone astray? And if so be that he find it, verily I say unto you, he rejoiceth more of the sheep than of the 99, and which went not astray. Even so it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish.
So what are these verses actually teaching? These 5 verses. These verses are teaching that as it relates to God, God has a very precise care for everybody. Notice in verse number 10, he says, take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones. You remember Jesus grabbed a little child and brought him into the midst to teach the object lesson to the disciples who were asking who was the greatest in the kingdom. And then he says that in heaven, their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven. So even as it relates to the little children, God is concerned and he cares for even the little children. Then he says in verse number 11, for the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. God cares for all of humanity. And then he gives another example to further illustrate the care and the concern that God has for everyone. Verse number 12, how think ye if a man having 100 sheep, and one of them be gone astray, doth he not leave the 99 and goeth into the mountain and seeketh that which is gone astray? Even if it's just one lost sheep, God is still concerned about that. You would think, you know, if a man got 100 sheep, you know what, man, he lose one, he can get another one. No. He tells someone to take care of the 99, and he goes looking and searching until he finds that one lost sheep. So when you look at verses 10, 11, and 12, Jesus is teaching the ultimate care and concern that God has for everybody, for children, for those who are lost, for those who need to be restored. God cares for everyone. But isn't that like God? To care for everybody? Look at 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5. That's like God, to care for everybody. First Peter chapter 5. Notice verses 7 and 8.
Casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you.
Notice now, Peter says, and now this verse is a reference to prayer. Peter says we need to cast all of our cares upon him, and in return, what we find out is this: God cares for us. Isn't it wonderful when you know God answers a specific prayer that you prayed for? Yes, sir. Peter says, casting all your cares upon him, for he careth for you. And then you think about that now. You think about how many people on the face of the planet right now? About 7, 8 billion? Give or take. About 8 billion. And you think about out of 8 billion people, God can still answer your particular prayer specifically, precisely, in his own time for your life. And when you think about what Jesus is saying, how that God cares for us, Peter is telling us to cast our cares upon him, for he cares for us. And then notice what he says next.
Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, like a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour.
Now think about it now. As you're living your life as a child of God, trying to live and do what is right, trying to be faithful, trying to walk in the light, trying to walk in the newness of life, you need to understand you have an adversary, a foe, an enemy, the devil. But then on the other hand, you have the God of heaven who is so concerned about you. He cares to no ends of the world for you. And that's where we need to fix our attention on the fact that we have a God who cares that much about us. And Peter says we need to cast our cares upon him because he cares for us. Do sometimes in life, with the trials and tribulations and the weights of temptations and things that we go through in life, do we sometimes forget that? Yes. Do we sometimes forget that God cares about us? Sometimes we get so bogged down with all of the stuff that we have on our plate, and sometimes we fail to remember that God cares for us. Now, with that being said, I want you to go back to look at Psalm 8. Psalm 8. Notice how the psalmist describes the same situation. Psalm 8, start at verse number 1.
To the chief musician upon Gittith, a psalm of David, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger.
Notice these next two verses.
When I consider thy heavens,
He said, when I consider the heavens. Now, you think about how vast the heavenly realm is. He says, when I consider the heavens, what else?
the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which hast ordained.
You know that even to this day, with all of the $1 million telescopes and all of the stuff, all of the money science is spent, they still don't know how many stars in the sky. They can't count all of them. And it's interesting when you read about creation in Genesis chapter 1, how God created the sun, the moon, and everything else, and it just suddenly says he created the stars also. We're talking about billions and billions of stars. Oh, he just created them too. And so he says, now when I consider the heavens, and I consider the moon and the stars which you have ordained, look at verse number 4.
What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou hast visited him?
He says, now, when I think about everything that God has made, and I look at creation, and I look at just everything that God made over those 6 days, you mean to tell me God cares for me? I mean, he created the whole entire world, created the earth, all of the rivers and the lakes, the birds, the beasts, all of that, and then he turns around, he created me, and he cares for me. And so when Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 18, God cares for everybody. And thus, it is no surprise that when you keep reading your New Testament, God doesn't want anybody to be lost.
Right.
Because he cares for everybody because all of humanity is made in his image. Any questions or comments?
Going back to verse 10, Jesus alludes to the fact that the angels of the little ones,
Yes.
do we have angels watching over us? You know, Charles Turner sang that song all over brotherhood all night, all day.
Right.
Angels watching over me, my Lord.
Yeah, and there's been multiple songs. The problem with that is it's going to be you're going to be hard pressed to prove that. That you have guardian angels or angels watching over you. What we do know from scriptures that angels were real. Angels did exist, but angels had a specific duty. Look at Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 1. Angels minister on behalf of those who were going to be heirs of salvation. Hebrews chapter 1. The argument of Hebrews chapter 1, thus the point, is that Jesus is greater than angels. But I want you to notice Hebrews chapter 1. I want you to notice, if you will, start around about verse number 11. Hebrews 1, verse number 11. And notice what it says about angels.
They shall perish, but thou remainest.
He's talking about creation. He's talking about creation is going to perish, but Jesus, as deity, he's going to remain. Keep reading.
And they all shall become old, as doth the garment.
Mm-hmm.
And as a vesture shalt thou fold them up, and they shall be changed, but thou art the same, and thy years shall not fail. But to which of the angels said he at any time, sit on my right hand, until I make thine enemy thy footstool?
God never said that to the angels. He said it to Jesus when Jesus went back to heaven, but he never said it to the angels. But then notice what he says next.
Are they not all
They, the angels,
Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be heirs of salvation?
and truthfully, that's really the only statement that we have in reference to the work of angels per se as a specific directive. And so they are ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who shall be heirs of salvation. And so especially when you get to the book of Acts, you see on a lot of occasions, you see angels being present in situations where people were being saved and giving their life to God and things of that nature. But as far as a guardian angel, you would have to try to prove that with no other scripture. I think the point Jesus is making in Matthew chapter 18 is to show that when you go back and actually read it, he's showing that basically children are looked at by God intimately and intensely. Go back and let's read it. Matthew 18:10. Because then you would have to say, in situations where people, met their demise or bad things did happen to them, somebody could make an argument and say, well, what happened to the guardian angel? If something bad happened to him. And so you would be hard pressed to try to prove that. Matthew chapter 18, verse number 10. Let's read it slowly and carefully.
Take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones.
Remember he used children as an object lesson.
For I say unto you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father.
So in heaven, their angels always behold whose face?
My Father,
The face of the Father, and what else?
which is in heaven. For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost.
Then what's the next verse?
How think ye, if a man have 100 sheep, and one of them gone astray, does he not leave the 99 and goeth into the mountain?
Okay, good, thank you. So the emphasis in these three verses is really leading toward God's care for children, God's care for the lost, and God's care for those who need to be restored. So the idea there Jesus is teaching really is that God is the one who is concerned about children, about the lost, and about those who need to be restored. But for somebody to try to prove that we have guardian angels, I don't even know what passage that they would begin to go to. But you're right that there've been plenty of songs about angels and their activity with human beings. But you'd be hard pressed to prove it because the Bible says we have to prove all things, and you'd be hard pressed to do that. Anyone else?
I know Peter and Paul encountered angels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially
Paul and Peter in prison.
at times. Right. Peter was locked up, an angel released him from prison, Acts 12. While Paul was on the ship headed to Rome, Acts 27. There were angels present. But then, like I said, there were other times where they didn't have angels present, and they had to just deal with life. So that's why I would be cautious to try to tell somebody you got a guardian angel, to try to justify that based on this passage, because we don't have any other scriptures or examples where the thought is even there about guardian angels. Anyone else?
But God does have the power to intervene in one.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
To sustain. I know he used angels in war, defeat.
Oh yes, in the Old Testament.
Yeah, take a few men and the presence of the angel would help destroy a nation.
Yeah, and when you read in the Old Testament, one angel in one night killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. And you think about that, and so you remember Jesus says, as he was getting ready to be crucified, you know what, if I wanted to, he said, I can call, 12 legions of angels. And you think about that, that's about, I think, close to 1 million, I think it is. You look at that number. But Jesus said, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and go through with going to the cross. But if I wanted to now, at my disposal, I got 12 legions of angels, and they ready to go. Just God, all God has to do is say the word. And so.
We just need to keep in mind that the Trinity is more powerful than angels.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
God don't need an angel. He can intervene and, they can intervene and handle their own. They don't need angels to do nothing.
And not only that, but angels are created beings. They're not eternal like God. God created them. So we'll pick that thought up next week, Lord willing. So are there any questions, comments about Matthew 18 that we've studied so far? The overall theme is, we learned at the beginning of the class, is let's not be like Old Testament Israel, complain, beg, murmur, and chide, but let's be positive, encouraging, upbuilding, edifying, things of that nature. And then let's always remember that God cares for us. Thank you for your attention.